January 1975. A house in Southampton on Long Island. A woman of 66 is dying of cancer. She has been given a large advance by a New York publisher for a book she is not going to live to finish, and she is speaking onto a recorder because she is too weak to write. She needs the money for her treatment. Her name is Kay Summersby. 30 years earlier, she drove Dwight Eisenhower through the war. What she says in the passage that opens the book is that the general is dead and she is dying, and that when she wrote her first memoir in 1948, she left things out, changed some details and glossed over others, to disguise as well as she could the intimacy that had grown up between them. She died on the 20th of January. The book came out after. That paragraph and one passage in a different book published 2 years earlier are the entire foundation of what most Americans think they know about the marriage of Dwight and Mamie Eisenhower, and neither of them is what it looks like. The same woman published the opposite account in 1948 and denied everything. The second book was largely assembled by a professional ghostwriter, who later said the dying woman's contribution to the finished product was minimal, and the most explosive claim of all, that Eisenhower wrote to General George Marshall asking permission to come home, divorce his wife and marry his driver, came from President Harry Truman in an oral biography, and when a historian eventually went to the tapes that quotation was supposedly transcribed from, the conversation was not on them. Every other story in this series turns on a document coming to light. This one turns on a document that may never have existed at all, and here's the part that ought to make you angry, whichever way you land. Mamie Eisenhower was convicted twice in public on evidence nobody ever produced. Once for the marriage, once for something else entirely. Start in Denver. Mary Geneva Dowd was born in Boone, Iowa in November 1896, and she never wanted for anything. Her father, John Dowd, made money in meatpacking and was successful enough to retire at 36. The family moved to Denver in 1905 and wintered in San Antonio, and Mamie, the name was a family shortening, grew up with servants, music lessons, and a father who indulged her. She did not learn to cook. She did not need to. In October 1915, visiting San Antonio, she was introduced at Fort Sam Houston to a second lieutenant from Kansas who was serving as officer of the day. He asked whether she would like to walk his rounds with him. She went. He was Dwight David Eisenhower, 25, from Abilene, from a family with no money at all. On Valentine's Day 1916, he gave her a miniature of his West Point class ring, and they were married at her parents' house in Denver on the 1st of July. She was 19. Now held the shape of what she had just agreed to, because almost nothing in her upbringing had prepared her for it. A second lieutenant's pay in 1916 was very little, and what followed was 34 years of army posts: San Antonio, Panama, Washington, France, the Philippines. She estimated late in life that she had unpacked the household at least 27 times. They did not own a home until 1950. A farm at Gettysburg, 34 years into the marriage, bought when he was a 5-star general and about to become president of Columbia University. A rich girl who married a poor soldier and then spent 3 decades without a house of her own. That is the ground everything else is built on. Then, on the 2nd of January 1921, their son died. Dowd Dwight Eisenhower, called Icky, born in September 1917, died of scarlet fever 3 months past his 3rd birthday. His father almost never spoke of it again. Eisenhower himself acknowledged that he could not discuss it, and he described the loss decades later in terms he used for nothing else in a life that included commanding the largest amphibious invasion in history. This is where the marriage changed, and most serious biographers locate the fracture right here. 2 people who could not grieve in front of each other, who did not have the vocabulary for it in 1921, and who went quiet. A second son, John, was born in 1922. The marriage continued and by all accounts was affectionate, but something had closed. Keep that in mind, because 20 years later, a great many people will look at a distance between these two and reach for the simplest explanation, and the simplest explanation will not be the one with a dead child in it. In June 1942, Eisenhower went to London, and Mamie did not. She spent the next 3 years living in an apartment at the Waldman Park in Washington, while her husband became the most famous soldier in the world. She wrote to him nearly every day. He wrote to her at a rate of roughly 2 letters a week, a fact I want you to hold on to, because it becomes the central piece of evidence at the end of this story. And he was assigned a driver. Kathleen Helen McCarthy Morrow was born in County Cork, Ireland in 1908. She had modelled, then joined the Mechanised Transport Corps and driven an ambulance through the Blitz, which was genuinely dangerous work. In 1942, she was assigned to drive the newly arrived American commander around London. Later, she became his secretary. Later still, she was commissioned into the Women's Army Corps. She was with him constantly for 3 years. She travelled with him, ate with him, was photographed with him. Her fiancé, an American officer, was killed in North Africa in 1943, and Eisenhower was the person who told her. That they were extremely close is not disputed by anybody, including the people who most want to defend Eisenhower's marriage. It was noticed at the time. It was gossiped about at the time. And Mamie Eisenhower in Washington read the gossip in the newspapers like everyone else. When the war ended, Eisenhower went home and cut the connection completely. He did not contact her again. So, what actually happened, and how do we know? There are 4 pieces of evidence. Let's take them in order and be honest about each one. Piece 1. The 1948 book. Kay Summersby published Eisenhower Was My Boss, written with the journalist Frank Kearns. It is a wartime memoir. It is affectionate about Eisenhower, and it denies any romantic relationship, not quietly, but firmly. Piece 2. The 1975 book, 27 years later, comes past forgetting. My love affair with Dwight D. Eisenhower, and it is explicit. It describes a romance that developed in 1943, first kisses, declarations of love. It also states that the relationship was never physically consummated, which is a strange thing to include in a book being sold on the promise of an affair, and is one of the reasons some readers find it credible. Now, the circumstances, and they cut in both directions. Eisenhower died in 1969. Kay Summersby was diagnosed with cancer in the early 1970s and needed money for treatment. Simon & Schuster paid her a large 6-figure advance. She hired Barbara Wyden, a former Newsweek staffer and a professional ghostwriter, to write it. She dictated some material onto a wire recording. She died with the book still in manuscript, and Wyden completed it and prepared it for publication. And Wyden herself later acknowledged that Summersby had become so weak that her input into the final product was minimal. Read that again. The definitive first-person account of this affair was substantially written by a professional ghostwriter, working from partial material after the woman whose name is on the cover had died. How should you weigh that? Honestly, both ways. A dying woman with nothing left to lose finally telling the truth about the great secret of her life is a thing that genuinely happens. A dying woman who urgently needs money, with a publisher paying a 6-figure advance for one specific story and a professional writer contracted to deliver it, is also a thing that genuinely happens. Both readings fit every known fact. Neither is provable. That is the honest position, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise to give you a tidier video. Piece 3. The Truman Claim, and this is the one that did the damage. In 1974, the journalist Merle Miller published Plain Speaking, an oral biography of Harry S. Truman. In it, Truman is quoted saying that Eisenhower had written to General Marshall, stating that he wanted to come back to the United States, divorce Mrs. Eisenhower, and marry Santingoa Uof. In the quoted phrase, this English woman, that Marshall had replied by threatening to destroy his career, and that Truman himself, later, had got hold of the correspondence and had it destroyed. A President of the United States on the record saying he burned the proof. It is the single most explosive claim in this entire story, and it is the reason the story is famous. There are 2 problems with it. The small one first, because it should have been a warning to everybody from the start. Truman is quoted calling her this English woman. Kay Summersby was Irish, born in County Cork. The large problem is this. The historian Robert Ferrell went to the Harry S. Truman Library, where Merle Miller's original interview tapes are held, and listened for the conversation. It is not there. There is no Truman conversation about Kay Summersby on the tapes at all. Ferrell concluded that Miller had simply invented the quotations, and pointed out that plain speaking contains misrepresentations on a range of other subjects too. So the most damning evidence about the Eisenhower marriage, the letters Truman said he destroyed, cannot be examined, because there is no evidence they were ever written, and the man who said they existed does not appear to have said it. Piece 4. What the surviving documents actually say. In George Marshall's papers, there is a letter from Eisenhower to Marshall about Mamie. It asks whether his wife might be permitted to come and live with him in England. That is the opposite request. And in 1978, the Eisenhower's son, John, published his father's wartime correspondence with his mother, over 300 letters, written at roughly 2 a week across the years in question, professing love and devotion. It was published as Letters to Mamie, and it was published while Mamie Eisenhower was still alive. Summersby's book mentions none of this. So where does that leave us? Here is what can be stated. They were extremely close. The closeness was visible to everyone around them and was talked about at the time. Something real existed between them, and Eisenhower ended it absolutely when the war did. Here is what cannot be stated, whether it was an affair. The strongest testimony for it exists in 2 contradictory versions by the same woman, the second finished by somebody else after she died. The strongest documentary claim traces to a quotation that does not appear on the tapes it came from. The surviving letters point the other way. Members of Eisenhower's wartime staff who knew both of them denied it. A number of serious scholars have concluded there was no physical affair. Others believe Summersby's second account. They are all working from the same thin evidence and reaching different conclusions, which is what happens when the evidence is thin. Anyone who tells you with confidence what happened between Dwight Eisenhower and Kay Summersby is selling you a version. I would rather leave you with a truthful thing, which is that it is not knowable on the material that exists. Now, the second conviction, because this happened to her twice. Mamie Eisenhower became First Lady in 1953 and was extremely good at it and extremely popular. She was a natural hostess after 30 years of army entertaining. She had the bangs and the pink and the fudge recipe that housewives across the country copied out of magazines. She clipped coupons for the White House staff. She put up the first Halloween decorations the building had ever seen. She also had 2 documented medical conditions. She had a heart condition dating from childhood rheumatic fever, which meant long hours resting in bed. And she had Meniere's disease, a disorder of the inner ear that affects balance, which meant that the First Lady of the United States was sometimes seen in public unsteady on her feet, reaching for something to hold. Washington decided she was a drunk. The rumour was widespread, it was persistent, it followed her for the rest of her life and beyond it, and it was false. She had a diagnosed inner ear disease. There was never any evidence for the other thing, there didn't need to be. And through the same years, she nursed her husband through a heart attack in 1955, abdominal surgery in 1956, and a stroke in 1957, 3 life-threatening events in 3 consecutive years, in office, at a period of maximum international danger. So here is the ledger. 1948, Kay Summersby publishes a memoir denying the affair. 1974, Merle Miller publishes Harry Truman saying Eisenhower asked to divorce his wife and that the proof was destroyed. 1975, Kay Summersby dies. Her second book, saying the opposite of her first, is completed by a ghostwriter and published. 1978. John Eisenhower publishes over 300 of his father's wartime letters to his mother. She is 81 and has 1 year to live, and later. Robert Ferrell goes to the Truman Library, puts on the Merle Miller tapes, and listens for the conversation that convicted a marriage. It isn't there. By the time anybody established that, Mamie Eisenhower had been dead for years, and the story had been in circulation for a generation. That is how this works. The accusation travels in 1974, and the correction arrives in the 1990s, and the 2 of them are not remotely the same size. Mamie Eisenhower died on the 1st of November, 1979 at 82, at Walter Reed, the hospital where her husband had died a decade before. She had suffered a stroke in September. On the 31st of October, she told her granddaughter that she would die the next day, and she did. She is buried beside Icky and beside Ike in a small chapel in Abilene, Kansas. So go back to that house on Long Island in January 1975 and to a dying woman speaking into a recorder because her hands no longer work. I do not think Kay Summersby was a villain in this. She was in her 60s. She was very ill. She had spent 30 years being described by other people as the woman who nearly broke a president's marriage, and she was out of money. Whatever she said into that machine, she had earned the right to say something. But look at what the story was built out of. A book finished by somebody else. A quotation that is not on the tape. An English woman who was Irish, and a set of letters that a president said he destroyed, which no one has ever found a trace of. Every other woman in this series was buried under a document, an archive that opened, a seal that expired, a file in a locked closet, a result that came back 99.9% certain. Mamie Eisenhower is the only one who was buried under a document that isn't there. And the reason both verdicts against her stuck, the marriage and the drinking, is the same reason they were reached in the first place. A good story does not require evidence. It only requires that nobody goes and checks. Somebody eventually went and checked. It took until long after she was dead, and by then everyone already knew what they knew.